We talk about the global economy all the time as this very modern, almost purely digital phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely. Like it just appeared out of nowhere.
Right. We track our shipping containers via satellite. We watch stock tickers move in literal milliseconds.
Hmm.
And I think we just assume this level of interconnectivity is a product of, the post-World War II order.
Yeah, or at least the internet age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when I was going through the source material for today's deep dive, this really extensive historical analysis on the dawn of global markets and maritime hegemony,
Yeah.
it really struck me. The operating system for all of this stuff wasn't written in the 20th century at all.
No, not even close. If you really want to understand the mechanics of global trade, you don't look at the dot-com boom. You have to look at the 17th and 18th centuries.
Wow.
That era is basically the source code for the modern world.
The source code, I love that.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about the era that literally invented the multinational corporation
And the stock market.
and the stock market,
Mhm.
and really the whole concept of trade wars. So our mission today is to unpack how a handful of European powers, specifically the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and the French, how they transformed regional commerce into this single, highly profitable, and honestly blood-soaked global network.
It was incredibly violent, yes.
And more importantly, we want to look at how Britain eventually beat out everyone else to become the undisputed global hegemon by 1815.
It's a fascinating period because it's not just about exploration. We tend to focus on the ships and the maps, but it's really about organization.
Right.
It's about who could build the most efficient economic engine to extract value from the rest of the world.
And it wasn't a straight line. It was a messy, violent evolution. So let's start with the catalyst. We know the end game is a global market, but in the beginning, say around the year 1500, the target was very, very specific.
Yes.
It was the Indian Ocean.
Right, because Europe at that time was essentially resource poor. They were desperate for the luxury goods of the East.
Spices, textiles, porcelain.
Exactly. But the overland routes were completely blocked, or at least heavily, heavily taxed by the Ottoman Empire. So the race was on to find a maritime bypass.
And we can totally skip the elementary school version where Columbus bumps into the Americas by mistake.
Right, we all know that story.
We know that happened, but the source makes this great point that while the Spanish were busy extracting gold and silver from the Americas, the Portuguese had their eyes on the actual prize,
The spice trade.
the spice trade in the East.
Yeah, the Portuguese were really the first movers in the Indian Ocean, and their strategy is incredibly interesting, especially when you contrast it with what comes later. They created what historians call a trading post empire.
Which is a very specific distinction. I mean, they weren't trying to paint the map green, right?
No, not at all.
They weren't trying to govern the entire interior of India or Indonesia.
Exactly. They simply didn't have the manpower for that. Portugal is a tiny country, so they focused purely on the choke points.
The bottleneck areas.
Right. They seized highly strategic ports, places like Goa, Malacca, Hormuz, and they essentially ran a protection racket.
That's wild.
They required other ships to purchase a cartaz, which was a maritime pass, just to be allowed to trade in the ocean.
So it was about controlling the flow of goods,
Right.
not necessarily the production of those goods.
Precisely.
So they're basically the toll collectors of the 16th century.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But then we hit the 1600s, and the model shifts dramatically.
Uh-huh.
The Dutch enter the picture, and from the source material, it's clear they aren't interested in just collecting tolls. They want to own the entire road.
The Dutch Republic in the 17th century is an absolute phenomenon. We often call this the Dutch Golden Age, and for very good reason. They looked at the Portuguese model and realized it was terribly inefficient.
Inefficient how?
Well, the Dutch didn't want a piece of the pie. They wanted a total monopoly on the production of spices, specifically nutmeg and cloves, from the Spice Islands, which is what is now Indonesia.
And to do that, they couldn't just be merchants on ships. They had to be conquerors.
Yes.
The source details how they went into the Banda Islands and absolutely brutalized the local population.
Yeah.
Just to ensure that not a single ounce of nutmeg was sold to anyone but the Dutch.
It was an aggressive, unapologetically violent colonial model. But the engine behind this wasn't actually the Dutch government directly.
This is the crazy part.
It was the VOC, the Verenigd Oost-Indisch Company, or simply the Dutch East India Company.
I want to spend a moment here because I think it's so easy to gloss over the VOC as, just a company. But looking at the financial history the source lays out, this is arguably the most important invention in the history of capitalism.
Without a doubt, the VOC was the first true transnational corporation. But its real innovation, the thing that changed the world, was the joint stock model.
Which sounds a bit dry, I know, but the implications were revolutionary for anyone listening who invests today.
Absolutely, because before this, if I'm a wealthy merchant in Lisbon or London and I want to send a ship to the East Indies, I'm putting up my own personal capital.
Right.
And if that ship hits a reef or if it gets taken by pirates, I'm ruined. I'm completely destitute.
So the risk profile was incredibly personal and potentially catastrophic.
Exactly. The joint stock model changed the entire psychology of investment. The VOC allowed thousands of everyday investors to buy shares.
It distributed the risk.
Exactly. If a single ship sank, you didn't lose your entire fortune. You just lost your dividend for that particular quarter.
And this concept limited liability, it just unlocked a tidal wave of capital, didn't it?
That's the key. Because the risk was diluted across so many people, the VOC could raise sums of money that even European kings couldn't match.
Wow.
And they used that massive capital to build a giant fleet, hire a private mercenary army, and build fortresses. They were essentially a corporate sovereign.
A company acting like a country.
They could mint their own currency, sign treaties with foreign leaders, and officially wage war.
It's mind-boggling to wrap your head around. Imagine a board of directors sitting in an office in Amsterdam, legally deciding to invade an island halfway across the world just to keep the price of pepper high.
It's exactly what they did.
And for a long time, this really worked. The Dutch were like the Amazon Prime of the 17th century. They were faster, more efficient, and better capitalized than anyone else on the water.
They completely dominated the carrying trade. Even if you were an English or French merchant, you often used Dutch ships to move your cargo because they were simply cheaper and much more reliable.
So this brings us to the British pivot, which is a huge part of the source material. Put yourself in their shoes. You're Britain in the mid-1600s. You're watching the Dutch get insanely rich carrying your goods.
Right.
You can't beat them on efficiency. You clearly can't beat them on price. So what do?
You flip the table.
You change the rules.
Exactly. You stop trying to compete on the free market terms and you change the law. This is the origin of the Navigation Acts.
I feel like Navigation Acts is one of those terms people completely sleep on in high school history class.
Yeah.
But the source frames this as an absolute masterclass in state-sponsored economic warfare.
It absolutely was. Passed around 1651, the Navigation Acts were protectionism on steroids. Britain essentially declared to the world, if you want to bring goods into England or any of its colonies, it must be on a British ship, commanded by a British captain, and manned by a majority British crew.
So they literally just outlawed Dutch efficiency.
Precisely. They cut the Dutch out of the British supply chain by sheer force of law. And crucially, the British government was fully willing to use the Royal Navy to enforce this.
It wasn't just a bureaucratic regulation.
No, it was a direct challenge. And it actually led directly to 3 separate Anglo-Dutch wars.
But the wild thing is, it worked. It forced the British shipbuilding industry to grow massively because suddenly they had a guaranteed, legally protected monopoly on their own trade.
It did. It nurtured the British merchant marine in a sort of greenhouse until it could stand on its own against the Dutch. It's a classic historical example of using the power of the state to artificially build a commercial advantage.
Okay, so while this maritime chess game is happening over in the Atlantic, the British are also making big moves in the East. But they ran into a major problem there.
The Spice Islands.
Right. The Dutch have the Spice Islands on total lockdown. The VOC has the monopoly. So the British East India Company, the EIC, needs a fallback plan.
Right. They realize they cannot dislodge the Dutch from Indonesia, so they turn their attention westward to the Indian subcontinent. And honestly, at the time, this looked like a massive consolation prize.
But the timing ended up being incredibly fortuitous. The source notes that the Mughal Empire, which had been this massive, monolithic power in India for generations, was beginning to crack from the inside.
That political fragmentation was the key to everything. The Mughals were suddenly facing succession crises, regional rebellions, and severe financial strain. The British East India Company didn't just show up and conquer India. That would have been militarily impossible.
Right.
Instead, they infiltrated the existing chaos.
They became the ultimate mercenaries. They'd go to a local ruler, a Nawab, and say, hey, we'll lend you our disciplined troops and our superior artillery to crush your neighbor. But in exchange, you have to give us the right to collect taxes in this specific province.
Exactly. They turned military service into massive revenue streams. It was a very slow creep. They went from being mere traders to tax collectors to de facto governors.
Whale and the Frog.
By the time the local powers realized what was actually happening, the EIC had leveraged these regional disputes to gain total control over the most productive textile regions in the world, specifically Bengal.
So we have the Dutch maximizing corporate efficiency and the British maximizing political leverage and legal warfare. But as we move into the 18th century, the source shows how these commercial rivalries stop being just about trade routes.
Right.
They turn into full-blown global conflicts.
The scale really changes here. We start seeing what are effectively world wars long before 1914. The struggle for market share merged completely with European dynastic politics.
Let's talk about the War of Spanish Succession, starting in 1701. The source highlights this as a major pivotal moment. The fear among the European powers wasn't just about who sits on a throne in Madrid. It was about what the source calls a supermerger.
That's a really great way to put it. The King of Spain died without an heir, and the French king, Louis XIV, wanted to place his own grandson on the Spanish throne.
Which sounds like standard royal family drama.
It does, but the rest of Europe completely panicked, because a formal union between France and Spain would have created a superpower that controlled not just a huge chunk of Europe, but the vast majority of the colonial world.
From the Americas all the way to the Philippines.
Exactly.
So Britain leads a massive coalition to stop this from happening. The war drags on for over a decade. But I want to focus on the peace deal, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Because when you look at the terms, Britain didn't just ask for land, they asked for market access.
The Treaty of Utrecht is arguably the exact moment Britain becomes the supreme global commercial power. Yes, they got territory places like Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Gibraltar, which were highly strategic. But the absolute jewel in the crown of that treaty was the asiento.
The asiento. This is a critical concept to unpack for you listening. It was an exclusive contract, right?
It was. Spain had a strictly closed economic system. They legally did not allow foreigners to trade with their colonies in Latin America. But the asiento forced Spain to grant Britain the exclusive right to supply enslaved people to the Spanish colonies for 30 years.
And we absolutely have to be clear about the sheer horror of this. We are talking about the industrialization of human trafficking. But from a purely economic history perspective, as the source details it, this contract was the wedge that cracked open the Spanish Empire's monopoly.
It was the engine of the entire Atlantic economy. It forcibly integrated the British commercial system into the highly lucrative Spanish gold and silver markets. It fueled the triangular trade.
Right.
British ships carried manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and then sugar and silver back to London.
It's just a brutal cycle of wealth generation.
The wealth generated from this monopoly was astronomical, and it capitalized the British financial system in a way that their main rival, France, simply couldn't match.
So Britain is aggressively securing these monopolies in the West, but they're also simultaneously fighting France in the East. And this brings us to the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s.
Right.
The source mentions this event called the Madras Swap, which I found fascinating because it really shows just how global the chessboard had become.
It really does. You have active fighting in Europe, fighting in the Americas, and fighting in India all at the same time. During this war, the French actually managed to capture Madras, which was a major British stronghold in India.
A huge blow to the EIC.
It was a humiliating loss for the British East India Company.
But then they go to the negotiating table in Europe to end the war.
And this is where the global trade-off happens. Britain had successfully captured the French fortress of Louisbourg in North America, up in modern-day Canada. So in the peace treaty, they essentially made a massive trade.
They said, we'll give you back your fortress in Canada if you give us back our trading hub in India.
Exactly.
It just shows that these weren't separate, isolated wars. They were interconnected theaters in a single global struggle for leverage.
Absolutely.
But the result of all this conflict, by the time we get to the end of the 7 Years' War and then finally the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, is that the field has been almost entirely cleared.
The dust settles, and Britain is effectively the last one standing. They had successfully dismantled the Dutch commercial threat through the Navigation Acts and those naval wars we talked about.
Right.
And they had stripped France of its major colonial possessions in North America and completely marginalized French influence in India.
And the brilliant part, from a strategic standpoint, is that they did it by combining the best parts of all their rival strategies.
Yeah, exactly.
They adopted the Dutch joint stock model to raise limitless capital. They used the Portuguese idea of securing strategic naval choke points, and then they added their own unique layer of state-backed industrial power and legislative protectionism.
That synthesis is the key to their success. By 1815, Britain controlled the seas, the global financial markets, and the key production hubs. They had moved completely from a trading post mentality to true, undisputed maritime hegemony,
The Royal Navy essentially guaranteed the safety of global trade.
provided that trade benefited London, of course.
Of course. Which sets the stage perfectly for the 19th century, the era known as the Pax Britannica. But looking back at this 200-year period we just covered, from 1600 to 1815, the thing that stands out the most to me is how the very definition of power fundamentally shifted.
How do you mean?
Well, think about it. In 1500, power was land. It was dirt. It was how many acres you could physically control and tax. But by 1800, power was flow. It was access to credit, control of shipping routes, and sheer market share.
And that's exactly the world we still live in today. The transition we just discussed was the painful birth of the modern global economy. It established the unwritten rule that capital doesn't really respect national borders,
Right.
and that the state's primary role, at least in the eyes of these growing empires, was to secure and protect markets for its massive corporations.
Which actually brings up a really provocative thought to leave you, our listener, with. We spent a lot of time today talking about the VOC and the British East India Company.
We did.
These were organizations that started out purely as commercial money-making ventures, but they ended up governing millions of people, waging actual wars, and essentially acting exactly like sovereign nations.
They blurred the line completely. They were company states in every sense of the word.
Now look at today. We look at modern tech giants companies that currently have market caps larger than the GDP of most independent countries on Earth.
It's true.
They control the flow of global information, they're building the digital infrastructure of the future, and they're currently locked in this massive arms race for AI dominance
Yeah.
that honestly feels eerily similar to the 17th century race for the Spice Islands.
It's a very striking parallel. When a single corporation has that much direct influence over the daily lives of billions of people, and when it operates across international borders with relative impunity, you really have to ask the question.
Are we seeing a return to an era where the line between corporation and sovereign power is dissolving all over again?
It certainly makes you wonder who's really writing the rules today.
History might not repeat, but it definitely rhymes. Something for you to think about the next time you see a delivery truck pull up to your house with a package from halfway across the world. That's it for this deep dive into the origins of the global market. Thanks for listening.